everybody. It's such a pleasure to see so many of you tonight. As a reminder, the Hearing Help channel, if you need it, is channel 8. I'm Louise Bowditch, Brookline Mothers Out Front. Pat Marr of Friends of Brookline Public Health and I welcome you along with sponsors of this event. Brookline Department of Public Works, Brookline Department of Public Health and Human Services, Rotary, CAB, Elders Climate Action, the Public Library, and the Story of Stuff. We're delighted to present this timely program on the hidden costs of plastics to human health. We hope that the poster session provided some ideas about problems and solutions associated with plastics. Plastics are convenient and useful, but highly problematic as well. They're made from oil or gas and thousands of synthetic chemicals, which, unlike pharmaceuticals, aren't assessed for possible harms, immediate or long-term. Plastics are polluting our rivers, oceans, and soil. Plastic increase climate-altering emissions at every stage, from extraction and production to disposal. But there are ways to reduce plastics in our lives, our homes, and our community. Both the posters and tonight's speakers offer solutions each of us can adopt as consumers and actions we can take as citizens to reduce particularly single-use plastics. Our speakers will address the effects of plastics on human health and the environment and steps that Brookline has taken to limit plastics in our schools and our town. We've planned ample time for questions at the end of the program. Please write them on the cards provided. Everybody got one? We will ask at the end of the talk for you to hand them to Mothers Out Front volunteers who bring them to me, okay? The paper and pencil are part of the program because the pencils are from Darlene Johnson's sister's classroom, and the pieces of paper are from my attic. About 10 years ago, they got lost up there. So Mothers Out Front believes deeply in reuse. Our keynote speaker tonight, we are extremely fortunate to have, is Dr. Philip Landrigan, a pediatrician, epidemiologist, and public health physician. His research uses the tools of epidemiology to elucidate connections between toxic chemicals and human health, especially the health of infants and children. He's particularly interested in understanding how toxic chemicals injure the developing brains and nervous systems of children, and in translating his knowledge into public policy. Yay. For example, his early studies of lead poisoning demonstrated that lead is toxic to children even at very low levels. This research contributed to the United States government's decision to remove lead from gasoline and paint, actions that reduced mean blood lead levels in the United States by more than 90%. A study led by Dr. Landrigan in the 1990s at the National Academy of Sciences defined children's unique susceptibilities to pesticides and other toxic chemicals, catalyzing changes of U.S. pesticide policy. He's a special advisor on children's health to the EPA. He was also part of the medical and epidemiological follow-up of 20,000 9/11 rescue workers, and he participated in the World Health Organization's global campaign to eradicate smallpox. He's the recipient of so many awards, I can't take the time, as notably the Meritorious Service Medal from the United States Public Health Service. Dr. Landrigan is a graduate of Boston College, and Harvard Medical School. Please welcome Dr. Philip Landrigan, author, researcher, and public health expert. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. It's nice to be here. I used to, when I was in college, I used to study in the Brookline Library, so know the building well, and had some cousins who were police officers and firefighters in Brookline, so it's close to home. I grew up in West Roxbury. So let's talk about plastics. So plastics basically came on the market after World War II in the 1950s. And the first plastics that were produced were, for the most part, durable products with a long shelf life that were meant to last. Plastics at that time were quite precious. People did not throw them away. And then, slowly but surely, single-use disposable plastics began to come onto the market. I have a picture in my office. There's a picture from Life magazine where an idyllic 1950s couple, one father, one mother, one child, are throwing plastic plates and plastic forks up into the air, extolling the glorious joys of disposable living. And that was sort of how things began. And since that time, of course, plastics have come into, they've become ubiquitous in our lives, right there. We use them extensively in medicine. It's hard to imagine practicing medicine these days without plastic. Engineering, aerospace, transportation, computers, anywhere you look, you're gonna run into plastics. They're ubiquitous. And obviously very useful, very adaptable. And apparently, I underscore apparently very cheap relative to other materials. But it was in the 1960s and 1970s that the first inkling of evidence began to come along that plastics were not as benign as advertised. And the first clues actually came from marine biology. The marine biologists who were finding seabirds and whales and dolphins with their gastrointestinal tracts clogged with plastic bottles and bottle caps and stuff that ended up obstructing the animals and killing them. Turtles and whales that got tangled up in plastic fish nets. Probably many of you have seen those horrific pictures. But still for a long time, I mean, until as recently as perhaps 5 years ago, there was, is the microphone not working?
Move the mic a little closer.
Okay, is that better? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Until maybe 5 or 7 years ago. Closer, I'll come, I'll do it this way. Okay, all right, swallow it.
Eat it.
So, sort of like Elvis Presley, okay. So it was approximately maybe 5, 7, 8 years ago that people finally began to realize that what was happening to the seagulls and the whales was not happening in isolation, that there might be repercussions for human health as well. The first indication of human harm came, as it so often does in medicine, from studies of workers. Because when you think about it, workers who produce plastic are more heavily exposed than the rest of us. They're exposed to new products, they're exposed earlier. And the first hint that plastic could really cause serious damage to human health was a cluster of 4 cases of a very rare cancer called angiosarcoma of the liver, which occurred among workers who were employed in a PVC polymerization plant down in Louisville, Kentucky. And it came to attention because it was such an unusual cancer that the grouping of 4 cases in a small group of workers caught attention. It was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and all of a sudden people started thinking about plastics as a human hazard, but still the evidence was kind of fragmentary. And then through the 90s and the early years of this century, people began, epidemiologists and pediatricians, began studying the individual chemicals in plastics, things like phthalates and bisphenol A and brominated flame retardants, doing clinical studies, doing epidemiologic studies, and learning that these chemicals could damage health, especially damage children's health, cause brain damage, cause reproductive problems, could disrupt the endocrine system. but still the chemicals were being looked at in isolation. The marine biological phenomena were being studied in isolation. People weren't yet putting the whole picture together. And then finally, some folks down in Australia who had started out as marine biologists and who were gravitating towards human health came to our group at Boston College a few years ago, and they said, can you put together a group of experts to take a really comprehensive look at plastics hazards to human health across the whole plastic life cycle, the plastic life cycle from production through use and on into ultimate disposal into the environment. So we got about 30 or 40 of our closest friends. We pulled together a group and we started working. And what I'm going to do is take you through the main findings of this analysis that we did and mention the key recommendations and try to get done within the allotted time. So we started out by asking ourselves, okay, what is plastic? What exactly is this stuff? And Louise already foreshadowed this. We realized that all plastics are basically fossil fuels in another form. There's a very tiny fraction of the market is so-called bioplastics, but 99% of plastics are made from coal, from gas, from oil. And every plastic has two main components, no matter what it is. Firstly, there's a polymer. A polymer is a very large molecule that consists of small repeating molecules that bond together to form a matrix, a skeleton, a structure for the plastic. And you know the names of these things. It's polyvinyl chloride, polystyrene, polyurethane, polyethylene. All of those are the polymers that constitute the structure. And then a whole series of chemicals, at least 16,000 different chemicals, are inserted into those polymers to give the polymers particular properties, to give it color, to give it stability, to make them flexible, to make them flame retardant, to enable them to resist water. And these are things like phthalates, like brominated flame retardants, like PFAS chemicals, even heavy metals in some cases like lead. Most of those chemicals, lead's an exception, but most of them are themselves petrochemicals, so they too come from fossil fuels. And then, so the production of plastic, and so the first thing we did was say to ourselves, what is plastic? And I've just answered that. Then the next question we asked, okay, in order to analyze plastics harms across the life cycle, we need to define the life cycle. So we realized that the life cycle has three phases: production, use, and disposal. And then there are subheadings in each of those. So production begins with coal mining, if you're making your plastic from coal, or with fracking, or with oil drilling. Then there's a transportation phase where the gas or the oil or the coal has to be carried from the mine to the factory. Then there's a factory where the basic plastic is produced, and then secondary and even tertiary factories where the basic plastic is converted into particular products. And those are the components of plastic production. And as we delved into that, we realized that every single aspect of plastic production was associated with harms to human health. So the coal miners, the fracking workers, the oil well workers are exposed to a whole slew of toxic chemicals that are involved in those processes. The miners are exposed to coal dust. They're at risk of black lung disease. Miners and oil field workers have some of the highest rates of traumatic injury in the whole American workforce. And then in plastic production and plastic fabrication, workers are exposed to thousands of chemicals, like those PVC workers in Kentucky who were exposed to vinyl chloride monomer. People are exposed to benzene, which causes leukemia, to 1,3-butadiene, which causes leukemia. There's a list of, which is a whole toxicology textbook. And then there are toxic dusts in plastic production. David Kern, who was a researcher at Brown University, found a number of years ago that workers who were making polar fleece, like this thing that I have on, inhale dust in that operation and get a form of lung disease, which is now known as flock worker's lung. Then in plastic use, when you and I and our kids and our grandkids use plastic products, we are exposed to all those 16,000 chemicals that are in the plastics, because those chemicals don't stay in the plastic. When the plastic is bended and folded, when kids chew on it, when it goes into the microwave, the chemicals escape from the plastic and they get into the food that you're cooking, they get into the environment, they get into the house dust, and then they get into us. Then when plastics are disposed, I think most of us, certainly I operated under the belief until just a few years ago that when I diligently put my waste plastic in the proper bin, that the plastic was going to be recycled. Not so. Only about something like 8% of all plastic is truly recycled and reused. And it's not 8% of all plastic. This is way below the percentage of paper or cardboard or glass or aluminum. All of those are recycled to quite high percentages. And the reason plastic is recycled so ineffectively, it's not because people don't care. I see the kids on campus very diligently putting the plastic waste in the proper bin. The problem is with the plastic itself. It's so heterogeneous. There are so many different types of plastic. There's so much toxic stuff in the plastic that it simply can't be recycled, it can't be reused, it can't be put into products that come into contact with people. So what happens to the waste plastic? Basically three things. Either it gets buried in a landfill and clogs up the landfill. It gets burned, either just open burning to get rid of it or burn for fuel in developing countries. Or it gets shipped overseas where waste pickers who earn like $2 a day go through the plastic and pick out what they can pick. So basically, plastic is a global issue, but it's particularly a problem in low-income and middle-income countries where vast quantities of plastic are piling up on beaches, fouling the ocean, getting into the food supply. So the conclusion of our group, which was called the Commission on Plastics and Human Health, is that plastics harm human health at every stage of the life cycle, and that it causes a series of diseases that affect humans at every stage of the human life cycle. So let me just enumerate a few of those without trying to be comprehensive. So in exposures to plastic chemicals like phthalates during pregnancy, increased risk of miscarriage, increased risk of low birth weight, increased risk of stillbirth. Exposures to children, increased risk of childhood cancer, increased risk of asthma. Exposures of adults to these chemicals, increased risk of heart disease and stroke. Bisphenol A, which is a chemical widely used in plastic, disrupts lipid metabolism, cholesterol metabolism in the liver, which leads to elevated serum lipid levels, which in turn increases risk of diabetes, heart disease, and stroke. And then all of those impacts are magnified in people like myself with gray hair. So, or my medical school classmate Jerry Lazar with less hair. So, so that plastic causes disease at every stage of its life cycle, and it harms human health at every stage of the human life cycle. Another aspect of plastics are that they harm health indirectly by contributing to climate change. Plastic production is hugely energy intensive. It generates about 2 gigatons of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere each year. That's about 4% of all the greenhouse gases that are emitted. It's more than the annual CO2 budget of Brazil. It's a huge contribution. That's a further aspect. Plastic is expensive. We think of plastic as cheap. We use it, we throw it away. It's relatively cheap at the supermarket. You're done with it. It just seems cheap. But plastic, we now understand, has hidden costs. And one of the members of our commission was a distinguished economist from the University of Maryland, Professor Maureen Cropper, and she analyzed 2 aspects of the cost of plastic: the cost of plastic production and the cost of the chemicals in plastic. And looking at plastic production globally, She looked at the costs and the health. She looked only at the health-related costs, not the environmental costs. The health-related costs include the costs of disease and injury in workers, disease and injury in the communities that surround plastic production facilities, and the costs that result from the carbon dioxide emitted to the atmosphere, which drives climate change. And she calculated that those costs total out to about to about $600 billion globally each year. 600 billion with a B. And those costs are, of course, not borne by the plastic industry. Quite the contrary, they are externalized, to use the economist phrase, which is to say they're dumped on governments and they're dumped on all of us as taxpayers. She looked additionally at the costs that result from diseases caused by those chemicals in plastic, the various additives that are in plastic, and looking at 35, I think, was countries that constitute approximately a third of the world's population. She found that those costs total out to about 900 billion. So adding the two together, because the two categories are quite separate, it's legitimate to add them together. It's about $1.5 trillion each and every year are the externalized costs of plastic that are foisted upon the public. So we're all paying that. And by the way, I don't have the exact figures, but just to sweeten the story, the plastic producers receive huge subsidies from governments around the world. So in addition to externalizing their damages, they're receiving subsidies from the governments whose budgets they're hitting. And so they sort of win two ways and impose their costs on us in two different ways. So that's a very quick catalog of the many harms that plastic causes across its lifespan. The last big point I want to make has to do with the fact that all of these harms are getting worse. The reason they're getting worse is that plastic production is increasing almost exponentially. It's increased about 200-fold since the 1950s. It's gone from less than 2 million tons per year to over 400 million tons per year is the global plastic production. 2/3 of it is made in Asia. The USA is a big player, but not as big as China. The global plastic production is on track to double by 2040 and triple by 2060. It's actually increasing. Global production is increasing more rapidly today than it was in times past. Half of all plastic ever made has been made since the year 2000. It's going up exponentially. So why is it increasing so fast? It took us a while to figure this out, but it turns out it has to do with the fact that the companies that make plastic, the multinational corporations that produce plastic, are basically vertically integrated fossil fuel companies. So the same companies, think of Exxon or Sinopec in China, the same companies that extract the gas, the coal, the oil, also make fuels like gasoline and diesel, and they also make plastic. So taking a long view, and those companies do take a long view, they can see that the market for gasoline and for diesel is going down. People are buying Priuses, people are putting solar panels on their roofs. It's not happening as fast as a lot of us would like, but it's happening, and they can see the trend. But at the same time, they're sitting on vast quantities of oil and gas that they have pulled out of the ground through fracking. Fracking is very efficient. The United States is now the world's largest producer of oil and gas. We produce more than Russia, we produce more than Saudi Arabia, and that's due to fracking. And so they got this combination of a declining market for burning the stuff and increasing feedstocks. What does a rational petroleum executive do? He diverts his product into plastic, and hence they're producing more and more plastic. And at the very center of this strategy, the linchpin for the whole thing, is the increasing manufacture of single-use plastics, stuff that you use once, you throw away. Plastic bags at the supermarket, plastic bags at the dry cleaner, the plastic wrap that seems to surround every head of lettuce at Whole Foods. I mean, the list goes on. You can all put together your own list. And I think that the time has come when we have to realize that that something's got to stop here. Then there's one more dimension of plastics that came to light just within the past year in March of 2024. This has to do with microplastics. So microplastics are the invisible particles that result when plastic breaks down in the environment. When say a big yellow or blue bottle of detergent gets into the ocean, the waves, the wind, the sun break it up over a year or two or three or five, and it breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces, and finally into invisible microscopic particles called microplastics, and even smaller particles called nanoplastics. Those particles are basically just little tiny bits of plastic. They still have a polymer core, and they still contain all those thousands of chemicals that are in plastic. And studies done first in marine biology and then by medical folks over the past 5 or 10 years have shown that these microplastics get into the food supply, they get airborne into the atmosphere, we eat them, we inhale them, they're in our bodies, and studies have shown that these plastic particles are in the lungs, in the gastrointestinal tract, in the liver, in the placenta, in the testes, and in the brain. Until March of last year, nobody knew if those particles were causing any harm or not. They were there, they were detectable, they could be seen under the microscope, but there were no data, there was simply no data, yay or nay, whether they caused harm. But last March, a group of cardiologists from Italy, from Naples, published a big paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, a very innovative piece of research. What they did was they took tissue from the inside of the carotid artery. The carotid artery, we all have two of them, one on either side, runs up in the neck. It's the major artery that runs from the aorta up into the head, carrying blood to the brain. And in people who develop arteriosclerosis, who get arteriosclerotic plaque on the inside of the carotid vessel, those people are at risk of stroke, they're at risk of TIAs, transient ischemic attacks. And so cardiologists look out for those symptoms, and when they're confronted with a patient who has evidence of a plaque in their coronary artery, they want to get rid of it. And with today's technology, they can run a catheter up through the heart into the carotid artery and remove the plaque. Think of it as a roto-rooter, a very sophisticated, medically sanctioned roto-rooter inside your carotid artery. And what these cardiologists in Italy did was they collected this tissue from that plaque, they took it back to the laboratory, and they examined it under the microscope to see whether there were microplastic particles in the plaque. They had 312 patients. Roughly 60% of the patients had visible micro and nanoplastic particles in their plaque. 40% did not. Then they followed these two groups of people for the next 3 years. And what they found was striking. They found that the people that had the micro nanoplastic particles in their plaque had 4 times the risk, that is to say a 400% elevation in risk of either myocardial infarction or stroke or death over the next 3 years. That's a striking finding. It's only one study, so you can't take it to the bank. You can't say that it proves cause and effect. I certainly would not assert that. But nonetheless, it's a striking finding. It needs urgently to be either replicated or disproven, one or the other. And it certainly, in the interim, raises the level of concern about plastics. It pushes the whole level of concern, in my mind, into a new realm, and makes me speculate that if microplastic particles in the heart and great vessels can cause these kinds of effects, what about microplastic particles in other organs like the brain? What might they be doing to us? So to wrap this thing up, our commission made 2 big recommendations. We said that firstly, there needs to be a cap of some kind of a limit imposed on global plastic production. We simply cannot continue to increase exponentially like a cancer cell, making more and more of this stuff until we choke ourselves. And secondly, we said there has to be some kind of regulation, some kind of transparency around these 16,000 chemicals that are in plastic, most of which have never even been tested for their most fundamental toxicity. And we made those recommendations, and we directed them especially to the United Nations, because right now, as we speak, the UN is presiding over a process to develop a global plastics treaty. It's not going well because Saudi, Russia, and Exxon are vehemently opposing any kind of a limitation on their product. But the sentiment around the world is building, and the negotiations are scheduled to continue later this year, probably in late spring or early summer. So that's where we are. Currently we're in a situation where we're surrounded by plastic. The evidence of its harms is increasing. Efforts to control this problem are building, but they're still in their infancy, and there are still lots of chapters to be written. So I'll wrap it up here, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Landrigan. That's a very thorough overview of our problem. Now it's time to hand it over to our panelists, who are going to talk to you about Brookline Finding Solutions. It's a real pleasure to introduce our panelists tonight. First, a change in the lineup. Katie Weatherseed, known to many of you as the public face of Brookline's Department of Public Works, unfortunately is ill and can't participate tonight. But her very able co-worker, Eleanor Jamilowitz, Assistant Recycling Coordinator, will make a few remarks on Katie's behalf. Thanks for stepping in, Eleanor. This is a group of innovators who get stuff done. We bring you solutions at the local level. First, Miriam Gordon, Program Director at Story of Stuff, a national organization based in California. In 2023, Ms. Gordon joined the Story of Stuff as the Reuse Program Director, where she focuses on accelerating reuse in the food service and beverage industries. In her previous role as Policy Director of Upstream, Miriam helped to build the reuse movement in the United States. She's also worked in local, state, and federal government agencies, where she developed award-winning pollution prevention programs for plastics, food service, and recreational boating. Next, Sasha Palmer, Food Services Director, Public Schools of Brookline. With the leadership of Ms. Palmer, the Public Schools of Brookline Food Services Program has become one of the most sustainable programs in Massachusetts. Sasha has led the transition away from plastics, toxic PFAS chemical products, and single-serve items to sustainable, reusable serviceware. She's also initiated the robust food rescue program in Public School of Brookline cafeterias. Katie, who's not here, Katie Weatherseed, Brookline Department of Public Works Zero Waste Program Manager. We wish Katie a speedy recovery. In her role as Zero Waste Program Manager, Ms. Weatherseed has integrated zero waste practices in all town operations. Katie developed and implemented composting programs in the schools. She formalized protocols for plastic-free public events and expanded recycling of organics, textiles, and hazardous waste. Under her leadership, the town has begun a popular free drop-off of organic waste for composting at several sites around town, and Eleanor will speak about that. So let's go with our panelists, starting with Miriam. Please hold your questions. We'll have ample time at the end of the program.
Thank you so much, Louise. I'm so excited to be here and to be with this wonderful group of local environmental activists, and also with the esteemed Dr. Landrigan, who I think did an amazing job for a scientist of talking to us in plain English that we can all understand. It's a real art, I can tell you, having listened to a lot of scientists. I'm with the Story of Stuff project, and while I had an introduction, my organization didn't. So how many of you have heard of the Story of Stuff? Okay, a handful. So we were founded in 2007 after our founder launched one of the first animated videos to incite, to raise awareness about environmental problems and the environmental catastrophes that we're facing. And it inspired a lot of action. And so the founders realized that by putting out films, this was an animated cartoon character film that explains sort of the life cycle of the production, use, and disposal of all the stuff in our lives and how we're getting it wrong. That inspired so many people to want to take action that it really founded our organization, and that's what we do. We produce films, video, media content, and then we get engaged in policy work, and we use that media to engage people to take action at all levels, whether it's corporate pressure campaigns or inspiring action at the federal, state, or the local level on policies. And we also produced a feature-length video called The Story of Plastic. So if you want to really see what Dr. Landrigan was talking about, the life cycle of plastic and how it impacts people who are on the front lines of the whole life cycle, the extraction, the fracking, the production in Cancer Alley in Louisiana, and the disposal, and what happens when we ship all of our plastics overseas and dump it on other countries. And that is a really good visual portrayal of the problem, and how really this is also an environmental justice problem, because the people who are most impacted along the life cycle of plastics tend to be people who, we don't cite incinerators, and we don't generally drill in wealthy areas. It generally tends to be poor community, and we don't process our plastics in wealthy areas either. It tends to be poor communities and communities of color. So it's truly an environmental justice. Although, with some exceptions, because if you go to Beverly Hills, you can find some drilling rigs there as well. So I just wanted to point that out and encourage you to take a look at The Story of Plastic and some of our other content. But I think the question is, how do we respond to this health disaster and this climate change disaster of all this production of plastic? So, of course, we can take personal action, and I'm sure many of you are doing that. Trying to choose products that aren't packaged in plastic, trying not to microwave in plastic, bringing your own reusable water bottle. I see a lot of them here, and trying to take personal action. But the problem is that it's really hard to do that because we're not being offered products in other ways. And increasingly, I'm sure you've all noticed over your lifetime, every time you go to the store, more and more things are packaged in single-use plastics. So we just don't have a lot of choice about it. And I was going to say, that in addition to health, climate change is another reason why we absolutely have to take action. But how do we get beyond personal action, which I think this just died.
Just died.
So I'm going to talk to you. Can you hear me this way?
No, that one.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. So in addition to personal action, what else do we do to change this system and to influence companies to change the way that they're providing products to us? And that generally comes down to needing to put pressure on corporations and also having policies that regulate them and force them to change the way they produce and provide products to us. So when we look at plastics, where is most of it? So if we're going to take these actions, especially in the policy arena, which is where I focus. Where do we focus our policy actions on plastic? So plastic is primarily being produced as packaging and single-use products like bags, plastic bags. It's being produced for construction and building materials and in the automotive section, in the automotive industry. And for us as local activists and to work on impacting policy and making change that way, really packaging and single-use products are the place to start. 40% of plastics production goes into the manufacture of packaging. So focusing in that arena would have a very big impact. But the key challenge of focusing on single-use plastics packaging and product bans is that when we ban the plastic, we often get regrettable substitutes. We get other single-use materials that take their place. The products that replace them, like paper and aluminum, come with a whole host of their own environmental impacts as well as health impacts. So let's just start with health, for example. So if I want to ban single-use plastic food packaging, what's going to take its place? Paper primarily, and maybe some fiberware in the form of compostables, right? And sometimes aluminum. Well, the thing is that there are 12,000 chemicals that are approved for being intentionally used in the production of food contact materials. That's a large group of products, but within food contact materials is packaging. So 12,000 chemicals being intentionally added into food packaging in the food packaging industry. And only 25% of them have ever been tested for their safety in terms of public health. And this is probably, you know this well. And that's because we have such loose regulations in terms of toxic chemicals regulations and consumer exposure. But even within that 25% that have been tested, we know that hundreds of them are carcinogenic. They're endocrine disruptors, and they impact reproduction and fertility. They cause chronic illness and disease. And so that is in our beautiful brown fiberware that looks so eco-conscious. That's in paper packaging that's compostable. And that's in the plastics, in the compostable plastics that are being promoted as a substitute for petroleum-based plastics. So from a health perspective, it's not a better transition to single-use paper and fiberware. For the planet, it's also not really a better option. So let's look at paper, for example. 3 billion trees a year are being cut down to manufacture paper packaging. In a climate crisis, that is the last thing we want to do, right? Because trees are a natural carbon sink. They absorb carbon from the atmosphere. They also provide cooling in a warming planet. They provide clean air and clean water functions. They provide biodiversity and habitat. And when you cut them down, what happens is a huge amount of sediment flows, you get erosion and sediment flowing into watersheds that create huge dead zones in our waterways. So we don't want to cut down our trees to make a product that we're going to consume in just a matter of minutes and then throw away. So what do we do? And then aluminum, another popular substitute product for plastic, single-use aluminum cans and foil. Well, it is highly recyclable, that's true. But most aluminum contains virgin aluminum content. So even though there's recycled content in aluminum cans, about 60% of the cans still virgin content. And the greenhouse gas emissions associated with producing that virgin content of aluminum are 5 times higher than the carbon emissions of plastic. And the mining of the bauxite to make the aluminum releases perfluorocarbons that are 9,200 times more climate impactful than carbon emissions. So aluminum and paper, while they're highly recyclable, on balance, they're not that great for the planet. What about compostable? So, and the other thing that we love about paper and aluminum is that they're recyclable, right? But when it comes to food service ware or food service packaging, for example, even if we are at the local level requiring that our products be paper because it's recyclable, food packaging is very contaminated with foodware, with food, with grease and oil. And so even though often local collection of recyclables is collecting it, it's much of it, if it's foodware, is being diverted to landfill and incineration because it's just too dirty to be recycled. Same thing with plastics. So where am I going with this? These things are highly problematic, right? So, okay, maybe recycling foodware isn't that great. What about compostables? Well, I mean, I come from California, and I'm here to tell you that our local communities have gone down this path. I've worked with local government for years, and a lot of the foodware policies have said, oh, we need to make our products recyclable, and then now it's compostable. But of almost all the commercial compost facilities on the West Coast now are saying, in fact, they don't want food packaging. They don't want bioplastics that can be composted, and they don't even want paper and fiberware that can be composted. Why? The bioplastics take a really long time to break down. So while the thin plastic film will break down, it does biodegrade more quickly. You get the utensils, you get the cups made from things like corn. It stays there, and they end up having to winnow it out, and it gets diverted to landfill or incineration anyway. And the quality of the compost isn't very good. It's got a lot of plastics and all the chemicals that are added in the plastics, or fiberware and paper and all the chemicals that are added in that. And so we're toxifying the compost that we're growing our food in. And these composters want high quality material that they can send to organic growers, and they can't send that material that has all that kind of crap in it. It also doesn't have any nutrient value in compost. So what they want, what commercial composters want, is your food waste and your yard waste and stuff that actually adds value. So I'm just going to say that while there are a lot of plastics that we need to get rid of, things like artificial turf and things that are just really bad substitutes for what we had before. We do need to think about the regrettable substitutes that happen when we just focus on the plastic. So what is a good solution? So I guess my message is that all single use is problematic, and the options that we have are to reduce single use and to transition to reusables. So at the local, and reuse wins, when you look at the life cycle impacts of reusable products, especially the non-plastic reusables, they aren't toxic. They don't tend to have toxic chemicals migrating out of them. And they are better for the planet across all environmental measures: greenhouse gas emissions, land use, pollution, any measure you can think of, even water consumption. So how do we transition? How do we reduce single use and transition to reusables at the local level? Well, skip the stuff policies are a really good example of a reduction measure. It's basically saying, no, you're not allowed to give customers accessories like utensils and napkins and condiment packets with takeout orders that they don't want or need, because we all have that stuff at home. I mean, how many of you have ketchup at home? You don't need that, right? And you don't need a plastic fork. So skip the stuff policy where you only get it if you ask for it is a really good example. And then with reuse, this is something I've been working on for a very long time. And we have now about 50 reuse policies all across the West Coast, and one here in Newton, Massachusetts, that says when you go to a restaurant, you're only going to be served with reusables, reuse for on-site dining, right? Makes sense. You know, McDonald's has to do this in France. All of France has a reuse for on-site dining program or law. So we can do that here, and we can and have done it in about 50 jurisdictions. And I also want to say at the local level, we need to elevate reuse services. So we have some fantastic ones here. I mean, for takeout, what are we going to do? We need a reuse option. We need laws that say when I bring my own reusable mug, that the cafe or the business is going to actually let me use that, and same with a reusable container. And we also need reuse services that when you forget to bring your own, you can take out with a reusable container. And we are getting towards working on passing policies that say these businesses need to provide us with reusable takeout containers that we can return to the business. So that is just some recommendations for local policy action. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Sasha, you're up next.
All right, thank you. Now I see the great segue into what I'll be talking about. I started in Brookline in COVID, and as I see most of the faces that worked with me during COVID, and we saw the magnitude of waste that that program produced. It was a great program producing individually wrapped food because at the time that was what was needed. But at that time, that looking at all that waste, and I can see the faces and hear the disappointment. I can, some of you can remember those disappointments of sharing how far we've gone back into moving away from the progress that the district was making. So it's good to be back here, and it's good to hear the other side and now truly understand why it's important for us. So there are three questions that I get asked on a day-to-day basis every time I get to share Brookline Reuse story. The first one is, why reuse? And I'll always respond by asking, why not reuse? And after listening to the other two members of the panel, it is evident that reuse is the answer to much of our such problems. So during COVID, we realized that not only did it impact our service, it also impacted the cost of our program. So I chose, it's my why reuse question is asked, and my answers are always, and I keep asking myself, and every time I look at my expense account, my paper expense account, I see the evidence of it. Every time I look at that point in 2018, 2019, when I was just starting in Brookline, and our Brookline article, I think I memorized it by now, 8.32 was to take effect, and that policy speaks to sustainable food containers. We recognize that reuse is exactly what we needed to do. So how did Brookline transition? Since we were already transitioning out of individually packaged food, we used the opportunity to also think about what is it that we're going to be serving those foods on. And a gift, a very generous donation of $162,000, that's amazing plug into the system, was used to kickstart this program. And that's when we launched the Brookline Food Services Reuse Initiative. And this initiative would transition all the schools to reusable. It would eliminate single-use servicewares and PCs, and also provide training for staff. Year two, a second round of funding was used to hire a sustainability coordinator. And I will say that is money well spent. Our sustainable coordinator, Rebecca, who is out today, she would have been here. She came up with a plan, and we had a plan on transitioning. So far, we've transitioned all schools except one, and for many reasons, the Pierce School, which is in transition itself as they're building.
It's most of the way not done.
It's already, and they will transition as soon as they come online in the next 4 to 5 years. So we've transitioned all schools to reusable utensils. 5 of those schools are 100% reusable. That's BHS, Tappan, Lincoln, Hayes, and the Driscoll School. The remaining 5 schools are between 50 and 75% transition. We based our success on 4 criteria. 1, utilization of software. 2, the use of stainless steel trays. 3, the removal of single-use and PCs, and the efficiency of the operations. Now, compared to last year, we have reduced the number of food service ware purchased by 20% and achieve over 75% of our target goal of reducing single-use items. With these actions, we've seen the amount of waste that we have reduced the amount of waste that we send to the landfill daily. And when they do all of those waste studies, Rebecca does our waste study, we can see the evidence of that. That brings me to the third question. What does it take? What lessons have we learned and why we succeed? First, we had a team. We need a team. This team of this type of work takes dedication, commitment, and I will say most important, partnership. And we've worked very closely with DPW on much of the work that we've done in the district, and the hard work of groups like Mothers Out Front, who I think were the catalyst. Second, have a plan. We need a plan. Third, having some autonomy over your program. We are a self-operated program, and because of that, we have control over who we hire, our procurement, and so on. Resources, you need resources. We were able to get funding through our grant, but other schools can do it through having a financially successful program. Thanks to Massachusetts, we are one of 8 states that is fully funded through universal school meals. And so it is possible. I will say, in concluding, that we are not unique. We had a vision, and this type of work can be replicated. We have great groups working with us. We have partnerships with the town, partnerships with community groups. We have a school committee that has put policies in place which does help to streamline those processes. And we have committed staff who are on the front line every day, putting in those works. And I would say, if you add a little Sasha to that, then you're all good. Then, yeah.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Eleanor Chmielewicz, and as Louise mentioned, I'm the town's assistant recycling coordinator. As you all have heard, unfortunately, our zero waste program manager, Katie Weatherseed, wasn't able to join us tonight, so I'm jumping in and taking her spot. As many of you may know, the DPW is heavily involved with many events that go on across town. Over the last several years, the zero waste program has worked with a lot of other departments to help reduce reliance on single-use plastic and instead encourage reusable and compostable items, particularly items given out by food vendors and also by event vendors in the forms of swag or gifts or prizes. This is all can be really difficult to do, especially when working with these food vendors who are used to serving their food on certain dishes. But we've had a lot of recent successes, as many of you guys know, as you are working our waste stations at the events. One example of an event that was very successful was Harvest Fest, which was run by the Recreation Department. We worked very closely with this department to distribute information advocating against the use of single-use plastics or single-use activities that would be given out at the event. We were also able to work with a lot of the food vendors to ensure that their serviceware, so that means their plates, their cups, their silverware, were reusable or, excitingly enough, at this event, that were compostable or, excitingly enough, at this event, reusable. And this was possible because the Recreation Department chose to choose metal customized cups as part of their swag. So we were able to work with one of their vendors to distribute those cups when they were pouring the different liquids. Similar vendor coordination and communication occur prior to many other events run by the town, such as the Summer Eats program, Springfest, and Brookline Day. These events are also utilized as an opportunity to educate event attendees and even other organizers and vendors about the value of waste reduction by providing interactive educational activities. Katie and I can frequently be seen setting up our large waste diversion trivia wheel with questions such as, are plastic bags recyclable, or how do you dispose of black plastic? And as a way of leading by example and showing other vendors and departments alternative giveaway options, we pass out seed pencils and seed bookmarks as a prize for participating in our activities. We also pass out reusable water bottles as part of our DPW internal operations, just so that all of our workers out on the road can always refill their water bottles. There's usually a very long line in the morning for our water bottle filler in our office. Additionally, several years ago, Brookline developed and adopted a zero waste framework to guide our work. This framework, which covers an array of short-term and long-term goals, identifies the need to advocate for EPR, or extended producer responsibility, on a state legislative scale. These types of policies hold producers responsible for the environmental impacts of their products throughout the entire product life cycle. This also entails us working very closely with partners in other communities and members of our Solid Waste Advisory Committee, many of whom are here tonight, to advocate for more substantial upstream changes that reduce the likelihood of certain materials entering the waste stream. Most recently, SWAC, the Solid Waste Advisory Committee, asked the Brookline Select Board to help write in support of passage of paint EPR bills in the House and the Senate. And these bills pretty much call for the implementation of a product stewardship system for unneeded paint. Additionally, EPR advocacy and legislation pose an excellent opportunity to influence the plastic industry and ensure that the cost and impact of single-use plastics doesn't simply fall on the consumer. Shifting the cost from the taxpayer to the companies will encourage companies to use less plastic, and choose items that are more sustainable and recyclable. The Zero Waste team will continue to work with members of the Solid Waste Advisory Committee and other professionals from local communities to advocate for these types of policy changes in order to create systemic changes and drive us towards a more circular economy. And additionally, I just wanted to quickly mention the DPW's work being done to divert food waste from the waste stream. Not only are we continuing to promote our curbside and backyard composting options, we are also constantly working to launch and maintain successful school composting programs with a large reduction of the single-use plastics, as Sasha mentioned. And most recently, we implemented the town's first ever complimentary food waste diversion program in the fall of 2024. The food waste drop-off program consists of rodent-proof bins located at 4 sites around town, and these are accessible 24/7 by all residents. Food waste is collected regularly, almost once a day at one of our sites, and is converted into nutrient-rich soil. Since launching only in late September, the program already has gained around 835 participants who have diverted, thank you, who have diverted at least 24 tons of food waste just since late September. And we're really happy to see the success of this program and are wanting to see how it grows. We're really looking forward to that. Thank you all for listening in on my brief overview of all of SWAC and DPW's recent programs and recent work. And again, Katie shares her well wishes and wishes she could be here. But thank you.
Thank you. What an amazing, thanks so much, panelists. An amazing group of women who are innovators and people building a better future for Brookline. It's time for our volunteers to collect your questions. They are around, I believe. Yeah, everybody pass your questions off to the aisle, please. And they will be collected. And in the meantime, I'm going to thank you all for coming, of course, listening hard, and signing the petition. The action for this meeting is signing that petition in support of the spring warrant article, which will decrease the amount of single-use plastic in our town. So thanks for being good activists today.
Do you have to be a resident of Brookline?
Yes, you have to be a resident of Brookline to sign the petition. Thank you, Nancy Downs, Oceana. So while the questions are being collected and organized by Tracy and Pat over here, I have a question for you, Dr. Landrigan. Recently, the study that your group published and others that I've read and have been discussed today mention endocrine disruptors, particularly their importance in children, in the lives and health of children. Could you please tell us more about that and what does it actually mean?
Yeah. So let me take a quick minute to tell you briefly what the endocrine system is, because without that understanding, it's hard to talk about endocrine disruption. So the endocrine system is one of the several big signaling systems in the human body by which the cells in the body communicate with each other. The best known signaling system is the nervous system, right? You've got the brain and the nerves that move our muscles, move our tongues, enable us to walk. Then there's the immune system, which is another signaling system that enables us to fend off disease. The endocrine signaling system is comprised of all the glands in the body that release hormones into the bloodstream. So it includes the pituitary gland, which is at the base of the brain, the thyroid and the parathyroid glands in the neck, the pancreas, which releases endocrine, the ovaries, the testes, the adrenal glands, and so on. All of these organs release powerful molecules into the bloodstream that circulate through the body and convey messages, send messages to organs throughout the body. So for example, the thyroid gland regulates metabolism. If you have a hyperthyroid state, you always feel too hot. If you're hypothyroid, you always feel too cold. If your thyroid is in the right place, you're like Goldilocks. And likewise, your adrenal gland, if that door were suddenly to open and a wolf would come through it, the adrenal gland would pump adrenaline into your bloodstream and you would run out the other door impelled by that adrenaline. Now the endocrine system is especially important in human development, starting at the earliest stages of embryonic and fetal life. Practically every phase of early human development in children is guided by hormones. And if there's not enough thyroid hormone, for example, the child is born with severe mental retardation. There has to be the right balance of estrogen and androgen to regulate sexual development and ultimately to regulate fertility when a child grows up. So any foreign chemical that gets into the human body and essentially hacks the endocrine system can cause devastating damage, which is sometimes immediately obvious and other times not obvious until the passage of some time and cellular changes play out. So what are endocrine disruptors? Endocrine disruptors are a diverse group of different chemicals. They have no chemical commonality, but they have in common the fact that they can get into the human body and they can disrupt human signaling. And if they get into the body early in development, they can cause brain damage, they can cause reproductive impairment, they can cause birth defects in infants. So some of the chemicals that we've been talking about tonight that are common in plastics are notorious endocrine disruptors. Phthalates cause abnormalities of the reproductive organs in baby boys and lead to decreased fertility in adult life. Bisphenol A, I've already mentioned, hacks the endocrine system by disrupting lipid metabolism in the liver. Other plastic chemicals like brominated flame retardants interfere with brain development. So
Thank you.
that's
Thank
it's a
you very
long
much.
answer, but I think it's,
That's an
when
excellent
you give it,
answer.
when you're not talking to a medical audience, you got to start with the basics. Yeah.
This is
Could I ask a question? Is that program cost effective? It sounds like it ought to be. That program in the schools that you described, is it?
The food service program, the reuse, yes.
Is it, you've got data showing that it's cost
It's
effective?
an amazing program,
Yes,
and
we do.
people
We do.
all over the country call up and ask, how did you do it in Brookline?
Wow.
This is a question from Miriam. I think I can read it. Are there any plastics that could be considered environmentally neutral or inert? I'm thinking of plastic wood, which is used as a building material. Are any of them considered environmentally neutral?
No, and I bet Dr. Landrigan could answer
Okay,
this
that's
better
a,
than I
that's a
can.
quick answer.
But all plastics have chemicals in them that perform the different functions that Dr. Landrigan talked about. And, you know, I've read the studies, but that say there aren't really any safe plastics from a chemicals perspective, but I'd rather turn it over to a scientist to answer that.
Yeah, this is a tough one. I agree with what you said. There's probably no such thing as a safe plastic. On the other hand, when we're talking to people at the UN and talking about strategies for reducing plastic, I don't think realistically that we're gonna, in our lifetime, see a world without plastic. And so the way I approach it is I say to people, listen, you're intelligent folks. You can distinguish between the plastics that you really need in your lives and the plastics that are stupid and pointless and that basically fill a need that has been concocted by the industry. So in medicine, for example, I couldn't imagine practicing medicine in the 21st century without plastic IVs, without laryngoscopes, without endoscopes, without other plastic implements. The substitutes just don't do the job. But I can certainly imagine practicing medicine without disposable kits for suture removal that have 2 pounds of plastic and you use 1 pair of tweezers and throw the whole thing in the trash. That's silly. When I was coming up through training, we still had metal tweezers that then went down into the central supply room, were sterilized and used again tomorrow. You don't need plastic cups in the dining room. You can use these things like you're doing in the Brookline schools. So we have to use our intelligence to distinguish the plastics that, at least for now, we can't do without because we've got to survive. And what are the plastics that are just stupid that have been foisted upon us by the industry, which comprise the 40% of plastics that are single use.
Can I follow?
That's a good answer. Another question for you, Miriam. Black plastic. Black plastic was banned in Brookline, but it wasn't banned clearly enough. So it is part of the warrant article, which all of you have signed on to support. It will be specifically called out as black plastic to be banned in the town. But Miriam, why is it bad?
Well, it's bad because it has recycled content in it that is derived from electronic waste, which has brominated flame retardants in it. And this speaks to the problem of our recycling systems not being, starting out with toxic materials that we are recycling and not having strong regulations around what can and can't be recycled. So it might not be the wisest thing to recycle things that have brominated flame retardants into products that we're going to use for food consumption, where there's migration of brominated flame retardants can migrate out of the black plastic. But that's just one of I think recycled content for plastic that's going to be a food contact plastic is something that we really need to be concerned about, because it's just not, the regulations aren't strong enough to ensure that we're not going to get something else like polyvinyl chloride plastic being mixed in, or something else that's equally toxic. So yeah.
Reuse or takeout
Yes, yes. certainly, yeah. Do you want to add to that?
No.
Can I pass this one to Eleanor? Eleanor, I know that you're standing in for Katie, so maybe this isn't fair, but you can explain this one. Tell us how we can use the town's composting sites, the new public ones.
Here.
So there's a QR code on the side of each bin. You can scan that code. It'll take you to a brief sign-up form. It takes about 1 minute to fill out. It really just asks for proof that you're a Brookline resident. Once you submit that form, there will be a code that's shared on that screen, and that is how you can access the bins. So each bin has a small metal flap on top where if you open that, there's a punch code system. It's a 5-digit code. In the winter, you have to press a little hard. And then you can just twist a circular lock sort of mechanism and then pull open the bin. So I know I probably made it sound a lot more complicated than it is. I hope there's people in the audience that know it's not that complicated, but it is a really simple process. Oh, where are the sites? There's one at the corner of Beacon and Tappan, right outside of the Star Market. There is a location in the John Street parking lot, so that's right in Coolidge Corner. There's one back at the Brookline Teen Center, and then there is one right outside of the Elliott Recreation Center.
Thanks very much. This is a question, Sasha, what was the biggest obstacle in the transition and transformation that you were able to lead in the school district? Go ahead.
I think it was the complications and everything that was associated with COVID. We started our transition just out of COVID. So we had to provide education around going back into reusing rather than the individually wrapped item. It's also, and some of those complications include just sourcing the material. We coupled that with thinking about PFAS products, and so sourcing the materials were sourcing forks, spoons, trays were some of our biggest issues. I think it took us 1 year to purchase the quantities that we needed. Right now, things have changed. I've seen a lot of progress in sourcing these because so many other districts, our school districts, are interested in reusables and are thinking or considering the same type of materials that we use. So more vendors are coming on board in providing those at a faster rate.
Can I add on a bit
Yes.
here? I just want to add on. So it's very hard to live without any disposables, right? Without any disposable foodware. Like I am a huge reuse advocate, but I want to recognize that we do need to figure out what kinds of disposables might be potentially the safest, things that actually might compost properly without toxifying our compost and might have some benefit. So I want to point to where we're headed in California in terms of disposable foodware, what can be allowed. And after years of working on this, I would say there are a few products that are like compostable paper and fiberware that are free of most of the primary chemicals of concern for foodware. And if you want to, we are writing local policies that require that you have compostable foodware, no plastic lining, no plastic additives. And one way to ensure that is to go to Clean Production Action's website and look up green screen certified foodware. And they are actually looking at what's the chemical composition and the additives of foodware and listing these sort of fiber and paper packaging products.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Clean Production Action, green screen certified.
Good question. This is a question for Dr. Landrigan. Considering the effects on workers' lives, do you know of any organizations like labor unions that are working to help prevent harms to workers?
Yeah, well, at least for the next few days, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration is doing this at the federal level. And the big unions, for example, the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, the Service Employees International Union, the Laborers International Union,
They are focused on this.
they each have a health and safety coordinator who know about these toxic chemicals and do what they can to reduce workers' exposure.
Excellent. I have so many great questions in front of me. Another one for you, Sasha. Do you think the students in Brookline are learning the lessons of reusable? If not, how can they learn? Sasha, here is the mic by the base, so it doesn't fall apart.
Are they learning lessons of reusable? They are. One of the things that is great is the partnership that we have, the partnership with DPW, the partnership with student groups, the partnership with teachers, the partnership with school administrators that are helping us to communicate those lessons to students. A lot of the transition and the start of these program or the start of schools coming on board is led by students and students groups. So I think they are, and I would say having great partnership is what is helpful.
Great, thanks. Can I have that back? A question for you, Dr. Landrigan. Can we shame the petrochemical executives to do the right thing and not drive us into a planetary crisis?
Yeah, we've been working on that. We held a conference at Boston College in October, 4th and 5th of October, taking advantage of the fact that we have a number of theologians and ethicists on our faculty. It was a conference that brought together scientists, faith leaders, ethicists, and theologians to consider the moral and the ethical dimension of current patterns of plastic production and plastic use. And we basically issued a statement at the end of it that was signed by the Dalai Lama, by the Green Patriarch of Constantinople, by evangelical Protestants, by mainstream Protestants, by Catholic theologians, saying that current patterns of plastic production and use are not only unsustainable and bad for the planet, but they're unethical and fundamentally immoral.
Excellent. Thank you.
So you have to, in order to shame people, you've got to move beyond the usual suspects. And
Yeah.
that was our.
That's an important point, I think.
We can also sue them.
Yeah, that's another way. Yeah.
This is another question for you, Eleanor. When, and you maybe don't know the answer, you can say I don't know. When does the town plan to implement a compost program within public buildings, for example, town hall? And what are the real or perceived barriers to increasing this kind of program that you've just started that's been so successful?
I can't speak much to when different town buildings will have compost options. There's a lot of kind of footwork and legwork that has to be done with each of those buildings. But one of the big perceived issues that we've kind of been dealing with, especially with the launch of our new food waste drop-off program, is that people think that inherently collecting all your food waste in one bin will be a meal for rodents, and that is quite. Food waste has to go somewhere. It has to go either in your plastic toter, which a rodent could chew through, or it has to go in these metal bins that are locked, protected, and rodent-proof. So that's one of the things that we speak to a lot about our food waste drop-off bin. That's one of the big pieces of critiques that we get. This is going to be a buffet for the rodents, and I can assure you that it actually will keep the rodents off of your property from eating your garbage toters and instead put it off.
This is a follow-on for Eleanor. Why is there no compost bin in South Brookline? There you go. You can write that down for your coworkers. What can be composted, and can you bring food in compostable bags or just dump it?
The 4 locations that the sites are at was based off of a survey that went around for about a month and a half last spring. We had over 600 people fill out the survey, so we just chose the most popular locations. There is obviously, as you guys know, a lot higher population density in North Brookline, so that was our main focus. Elliott Rec is technically our quote unquote South Brookline location, but we do hope to launch more locations around town. You can drop off food waste, any sort of food waste. It doesn't have to be, it can be moldy. And you can use a BPI certified compostable bag, which can be purchased at a lot of different local supermarkets or purchased online. You also can just collect your material in some sort of container in your home and just dump it. Yeah.
Okay,
So either one.
great. It's getting close to closing time. We need to be out of here. The library has rules, as you all know, if you've ever been here. This is a question actually for all of you. Why, if so much data is now available connecting plastics and human health, why do you think environmental groups are struggling to get strong policies passed at both the state and federal level? That's the first question, and the follow-on is, do you have recommendations? So I will turn my microphone over to the panel.
You want to start?
Yeah.
I think there's,
For all of you.
yeah. I can think of 2 reasons. First, although there is a lot of information, a lot of that information is quite new. It's really only in the last 3 to 5 years that we've connected a lot of the dots. It was rather fragmentary until then. We're sort of where climate science was 15 or 20 years ago. And secondly, the opposition is very powerful and very well organized.
And they're controlling this.
Yeah, I was gonna say in my remarks, what you have at the local level is an opportunity to really make change in a sphere where powerful corporate interests aren't pumping tons of money into political campaigns. So I'm all for organizing at the local level and getting local policies passed and having 100 some odd bag bans, single-use plastic bag bans, so you could get a statewide policy, for example, and 100 local reuse policies so you can get a statewide policy passed, because there's so much less corporate influence at the local level. And what you have at the state and federal level are tons of high-paid corporate lobbyists from all the big industries who pump a lot of money into election campaigns. And even the best, most progressive politicians have to raise money for their party, and they have to raise money for their next election campaign. So there's a lot more influence at the state and the federal level, and it's only going to get worse. So organize locally.
Yeah. Sasha.
Absolutely. So we are a federally funded program. Or most of our funding comes from the federal government. Lately, a lot of more of it is coming from the state. I think one of the things that is, as the panelist said, advocate locally. What Brookline did was they have an article, they have community groups who, like Mothers Out Front, who are always asking. Thank you. I always tell you guys you're my favorite people. But that is where it started. Composting and reusable and getting us funding started with the help of local advocacy.
Thanks, Sasha.
In fear of being redundant, I pretty much agree with what everyone has said. And
I want to say something to echo Sasha's comment about how valuable it's been to the sustainability of the composting program to have the data. And the data will change the minds of the select board and of the town meeting members that will have to vote on keeping that program alive. It's funded now by grants, and the data that's being collected is very, very powerful. Sasha mentioned some of it in her talk, and it will make a difference. So the data matters, and it's been clear in all of the presentations this evening that solutions come from both passion and information. So I hope you feel passionate and uninformed and active as you leave tonight. Thank you so much for coming.